The night is thick with rain, the ink on a marriage pact still wet, and a young woman stands at the edge of her father's world, holding a prayer book that hides a dangerous ledger. In a single breath, duty demands her hand. Desire whispers of the pines of Glencree. A secret tallied in cold numbers threatens to unmask a predator at court. Footsteps echo. Horses wait. One choice will brand her a traitor, or make her free. Welcome to a tale of fierce hearts and quiet rebellions. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from and answer this. What do you love most about period romances, the grandeur or the forbidden longing? Settle in. The pines are ready to speak. Ireland, year of our Lord, 1596. The air in the manor of the Arden family was heavy with rain and resignation. The old stones seemed to echo the whispers of betrayal that had filled its halls for generations. Whispers of alliances forged not in affection, but in debt and desperation. Lady Cecily Arden sat by the tall window of her chamber, the chill seeping through the glass as she pressed her palm against it. Beyond the grey courtyard, horses waited, restless under the drizzle. Inside, her father's voice, measured, practiced and weary, rose from the drawing room below. He was negotiating her future as if it were a ledger entry, not a life. The ink had not yet dried on the contract that would make her the wife of Sir Alistair Fenwick, a man nearly twice her age, known at court for his brutal efficiency and bottomless ambition. He was the kind of man who never smiled unless it served him, the kind whose silence was more dangerous than another's rage. Her father called him a pillar of the Queen's will. Cecily called him the shadow behind her closed door. She stood, her reflection pale in the window pane, hazel eyes wide, chestnut hair pulled tightly beneath her linen coif, her hands trembling despite her effort to remain composed. She was the daughter of the gentry, raised to honor obedience and preserve family dignity. Yet at that moment she felt neither noble nor dutiful, only cornered. That afternoon she had seen the papers herself, her father's seal beside Fenwick's, the dowry sum, the promise of land restoration. The clauses binding her to a man she had met only thrice, each encounter colder than the last. But what pierced her most was not the ink, it was the faint scent of wax that still lingered on the parchment, as if sealing her fate with something tangible, irreversible. Later, in the flickering lamplight of her father's study, she found something she was never meant to see. Among the scattered trade accounts lay a smaller ledger, its leather spine worn from use. Curious, she opened it. The handwriting was not her father's. It was Fenwick's, rigid, precise, heartless. She read the first entries without understanding. Shipments, ports, names. Then she reached a page marked Wicklow Harvests. Beneath it were rows of figures, quantities of grain seized for the crown, all sold again at 3 times the price to merchants favoured by Fenwick himself. Each line was an act of quiet cruelty. Every calculation represented a family starved so another might feast. A cold tremor passed through her, her father's voice in the next room, the smell of damp parchment, the sound of distant rain, all dissolved into a single thought. I am to be sold to a man who profits from hunger. She closed the ledger and pressed it to her chest. For a moment she stood in the half-light of the chamber, her breath shallow, her pulse unsteady. There was no one to tell, no ally to trust. Her father would call her naive. Fenwick would call her insolent. The Crown would not hear a woman's word against a man with land and loyalty to offer. So she did what neither expected. She began to plan. That night, as the servants extinguished candles and the manor drifted into uneasy slumber, Cecily packed a small satchel. Into it went the essentials of her defiance: a plain cloak of undyed wool, her mother's prayer book, a pouch of coins, and the ledger she could not leave behind. She lingered over the book, its worn edges soft from her mother's hands. The ink faded, but the scent of lavender still trapped between its pages. It was the only blessing she would take from her old life. When the first light of dawn brushed the horizon, she slipped from her chamber and descended the back stairs. Every step echoed like a heartbeat she could not still. The corridors smelled of stone, wax, and grief. At the door she paused, her gaze sweeping the familiar walls, the hearth where her mother had sung to her, the tapestries she once touched in wonder as a child. She whispered a prayer, not for courage, but for peace. Outside, mist drifted low across the fields. The sound of crows broke the silence as she drew her cloak close around her shoulders. Her father's hounds barked once in the distance, then quieted, as if even they knew not to betray her. Cecily mounted the narrow lane leading north, her boots sinking into wet earth. Behind her lay duty, comfort, and the name she was born to uphold. Before her, an uncertain road wound through the Irish hills, toward a valley whispered about by traders and pilgrims alike. Glencree, a place of pines and quiet exile. The wind tugged at her cloak as she turned once to look back. The manor stood small against the grey dawn, its windows blind, its soul as hollow as the vows that awaited her there. Then she walked on. Each step carried her further from the bargain signed in silence and closer to the unknown life her heart demanded. The valley of Glencree lay veiled in mist, as though the earth itself wished to keep its secrets cloaked from the world. The pines stood like sentinels, dark and tall, their resin-sweet breath whispering through the hills. To Cecily, who had walked for days through rain and mud, it seemed a place suspended outside of time, a forgotten corner of Ireland where sorrow could rest its head, and perhaps, if God allowed, begin to mend. She arrived at the edge of the village with her cloak soaked through, her boots caked in mud, and her limbs trembling from cold and hunger. Her face, once untroubled by hardship, was flushed and streaked with the grime of the road. Still, she held her head high, not out of pride, but because it was the only part of her that had not yet been bowed by exhaustion. The village itself was no more than a scattering of cottages built of weathered stone and thatch, nestled between low hills and threaded by narrow paths. Smoke rose from a few chimneys curling into the fog. Beyond the village, the pine forest pressed close, enclosing the hamlet in green silence. The place did not welcome outsiders, nor did it seek the world's attention. Here, the crown's gaze passed like a shadow, brief and easily forgotten. As Cecily approached, a pair of young boys, barefoot and wary, watched her from behind a low stone wall. A woman in a patched shawl pulled her daughter closer by the hand and turned away. Even the dogs seemed to circle her with suspicion, tails low, ears twitching. She said nothing. She could not. Her voice was buried beneath weariness and the cold edge of uncertainty. What words could she offer that would not betray who she was? Then came a voice like a flint striking iron, sharp, unflinching, and tinged with authority. "You look like you've been chased by the devil and beaten by his horse." Cecily turned slowly. The speaker was a woman of perhaps 40, sturdy in frame, with cheeks flushed by heat and labor. Her dark hair was streaked with silver and braided beneath a kerchief. She wore a homespun dress and a coarse apron still dusted with flour. Her gaze, though stern, held a glimmer of curiosity. "I'm Myrene O'Sullivan," the woman said, "and you're standing in front of my bakery looking like a ghost come down the mountains. What are you?" There it was. Not who are you, but what? Cecily searched the woman's eyes and found something bracing, not cruelty, but the sharpness of someone who had no time for lies. She straightened, swallowed the knot in her throat and answered simply, "A woman seeking shelter. I can work." Myrene crossed her arms. "Can you bake?" "Yes." "Can you scrub?" "Yes." "Can you keep your mouth shut when you've nothing useful to say?" Cecily hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Myrene studied her another moment, then turned toward the bakery door. "Then stop standing in the mud like a cursed monument. If you collapse in front of my oven, I'll not carry you." Inside, the heat of the stone hearth was like a benediction. The scent of rising bread filled the space, mingling with the sharp tang of wood smoke. Cecily removed her cloak slowly. her fingers numb. She did not explain the fine stitching of her chemise, nor the slightly too soft leather of her boots. She simply folded her sleeves and began kneading dough beside Irene, her silence speaking the only language the village seemed to respect: humility. Over the next hours, Cecily worked until her shoulders ached. She swept the floor, carried logs, shaped loaves. Irene said little, only correcting her once when she reached for the oven too early. The other villagers came and went, glancing at her with curiosity and murmured speculation. She's not from here. No dirt under her nails. Maybe one of those runaways from the Pale. Cecily kept her head down. She let them wonder. When night fell, Irene showed her to the loft above the bakery, a simple space with straw bedding and a coarse woolen blanket. Cecily thanked her in a whisper. Irene paused at the door, her silhouette lit by the glow of the fire below. "I don't know your story, girl, and I don't care to, but if you bring trouble to this village, we'll bury it, and you, beneath the pines." Cecily nodded once. Understood. Alone in the quiet, she unwrapped her prayer book and pressed it to her chest. She did not pray. She simply breathed. The stars were hidden by mist, but she felt the pull of them, distant and silent. The days that followed were stitched together by repetition and silence. Cecily worked before dawn and after dusk. She learned to stoke the oven, to mend a torn apron, to stretch a single measure of salt across 3 batches of bread. She learned to speak little and listen well. But it was in the forest's shadow that something shifted. It was her 3rd day in Glencree when she saw him, standing at the edge of the pines, sleeves rolled, splitting wood with methodical ease. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his movements precise without being hurried. The rhythm of the axe was like a heartbeat in the hush of the trees. He looked up. Their eyes met. His gaze was not unkind, but neither was it welcoming. It was the gaze of a man who had seen too much and trusted little. Still, something in the way he regarded her was different from the others. He did not glance away in disdain or suspicion. He watched her as one might study the weather, carefully, silently, with a sense that what came next might matter. Irene called him Rafe Greystoke. No one said much more. He had arrived seasons ago and stayed. He lived alone at the forest's edge, taking little and giving less. Children followed him sometimes, barefoot and wide-eyed, and he never turned them away. That evening, Cecily spotted him again, this time in the chapel ruins where the children played. He knelt beside a boy with a scraped knee, wrapping the wound with clean cloth, his hands gentle. One of the smaller girls hugged his arm without fear. Cecily watched from a distance, her breath catching. There was something in that image. A soldier's frame, a healer's touch, that stirred something deep inside her chest. Something tender and almost forgotten. She did not speak to him, nor he to her. But the next morning, a loaf of bread went missing from the bakery table. In its place was a clean bundle of firewood and a strip of linen bandage. Cecily said nothing. She simply placed a second loaf near the window the next day. And so it began. An exchange without words, without names. A rhythm of quiet offerings passed in glances, in unspoken gestures, in the slow thaw of mutual recognition. By the end of the week, Cecily was no longer a stranger to the rhythm of Glencree. She rose before the crows. She scrubbed stones and peeled roots. She laughed once, quietly, when Irene scolded a dog for stealing dough. But most of all, she listened. She learned the names of the trees, the moods of the weather, the sound of footsteps on frost. She listened to the village and to Rafe's silence, and she began to belong, not by right, but by effort. In Glencree, no one asked where she had come from, but slowly, day by day, the village began to care where she was going. And somewhere between the pine trees and the smoke of the ovens, Cecily Arden, the lady who once sat by manor windows and dreamed of freedom, was learning how to live. The fog in Glencree had thickened by the second week of November, turning the pine forest into a kingdom of shadows and silence. Mornings arrived, not with light, but with a slow lifting of grey, and the wind whispered through the trees like a voice half-remembered. Life in the valley pressed forward with the rhythm of necessity. Bread to be baked, fields to be turned, wood to be split, mouths to be fed. And beneath it all, the unspoken understanding that the village survived not by favour or mercy, but by its own vigilance. It was on such a morning, when the dew clung like frost and the smoke of the hearths rose pale into the sky, that Cecily followed Myrene into the woods with a basket of oats and a flask of broth. They said it was for the old shepherd in the hills, but no one had seen a shepherd in Glen Cree for several winters. Myrene's eyes dared her to question it, and Cecily by then had learned not to ask what others refused to answer. They walked until the brambles gave way to narrow paths, and then deeper still, until even the sound of the village fell behind. At the base of a moss-covered slope stood a small bothy, half hidden by ivy and thyme. Smoke curled faintly from a hole in the thatched roof. Myrene knocked twice, then opened the wooden door. Inside, the air was thick with warmth and the scent of pine. Blankets were laid over straw bedding. Wooden bowls lined a shelf carved into the wall. But what caught Cecily's breath were the eyes, 6 pairs of them, watching her in utter silence. Children, some no more than toddlers, one no older than 10. Their faces were pale, their limbs thin, but their gaze steady and sharp, like foxes too young to fear but too wise to trust. One of them clutched a doll made of sticks and scraps of wool. Another had a bandaged hand, the cloth clean and neatly wrapped. Beside the hearth, a pot simmered, and in the corner, washing a wooden spoon with quiet purpose, stood Rafe Greystoke. He turned to her slowly, a streak of soot on his jaw, sleeves rolled above his elbows. His expression revealed nothing, but his eyes, those slate-blue eyes, held her gaze longer than politeness allowed. "She brought broth," Myrene said simply, placing the basket near the fire. "And her silence." Rafe nodded once. "Then she can stay. For now." Cecily said nothing. She lowered her hood and stepped forward, kneeling beside the boy with the bandaged hand. He did not flinch. She offered him a piece of warm oatcake, and after a beat, he took it without a word. From that moment the rhythm changed. She began coming daily, always with something small, a jar of salve, a loaf of bread, a scarf sewn from scrap linen. Myrene spoke less each time, eventually leaving Cecily to walk the path alone. At first, the children ignored her, then they tolerated her. Then, one morning, the youngest, a wide-eyed girl named Bridget, crawled into her lap and fell asleep. Cecily didn't move for an hour. She only sat, stroking the child's tangled hair, while the fire crackled and Rafe stirred soup behind her. In the quiet moments of tending, listening and learning, Cecily began to see what no one had dared to say aloud. These were the lost, orphans of conflict, survivors of vanished homesteads, children born of soldiers and widows, of famine and fear. And Rafe, once an officer of the Crown, now served as their protector, teacher and physician. He spoke little, but watched everything. His hands, though calloused, moved gently, lifting a child with care, braiding a girl's hair when no one else would, drawing a map on the dirt floor to teach a boy the difference between north and east. One afternoon, as the children napped beneath blankets, Cecily cleaned the shelves and noticed a pile of folded pages, maps, annotated with dates and routes. Some marked abandoned patrol posts, others stores of grain that had gone missing. "You were tracking the seizures," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Rafe, sitting in the doorway sharpening a blade, looked up. "Not all battles are fought with muskets." Their eyes met. She felt the air shift. He stood, slowly wiping his hands on a cloth, and walked toward her. His presence filled the room, not with threat, but with gravity. "You're not a baker's niece," he said. It was not an accusation. "No," she answered. "You're educated, careful, listening when others speak." "I am," she said. "You're afraid, but not for yourself." Cecily's throat tightened. "For them." A long silence passed. Then he nodded, once, solemnly, and turned back to his blade. That night, in the small loft of the bakery, Cecily could not sleep. The fire had long since faded to embers. She sat with her prayer book in her lap, but did not open it. Instead, she retrieved a small leather-bound notebook from her satchel, the one she had carried since before the road had turned muddy beneath her feet. By candlelight, she began to copy the stories she had heard in the village. Not gossip, but details. Names of families who had lost their harvests, patterns of grain shortages that coincided with soldier movement. She listed dates, prices, surnames whispered in fear. She began to draw a thread, not yet a noose, but a line that, if followed, would one day tie truth to those who had tried to bury it. She did not know what she would do with it, but her hands refused to stop. And in the forest, Rafe sharpened another blade, not for battle, but for carving wood. He had begun a new figure for Bridget, a pine tree, small enough to fit in her hand, its bark smoothed like silk. The valley breathed, watched, and remembered. But not all eyes in Glencree were gentle. It was the 10th day after Cecily had begun her visits to the bothy when news reached the bakery. A boy from the village, a stable hand, barely 12, had been beaten near the lower path. His face bloodied, his tunic torn. He had refused to speak to a pair of mounted soldiers, asking about a stranger woman. Myrene slammed a jug down upon the table when she heard. "Fenwick's men," she spat. "They're circling now, like dogs that smell their quarry but can't yet see it." Cecily felt the cold creep up her spine. That night, she visited Rafe in the bothy under the cover of dark. The wind had risen, and the pines swayed like grieving women. She found him seated by the fire, the children asleep, his expression darker than the sky. "They've drawn blood," he said, without looking at her. "I know. If you stay, more will follow. I'm not leaving." Rafe stood and faced her, his jaw tight. "You cannot protect this valley by hiding truths in a notebook." "I'm not hiding them," she said. "I'm preserving them." Their words hovered in the air, brittle and sharp. Then his voice softened. "What are you really trying to build?" Cecily stepped forward, the firelight catching in her eyes. A reckoning. They stood in silence, the fire between them, the children's quiet breathing behind. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees, as if the forest itself was listening. And in that silence a bond formed, not spoken, not sealed by touch, but forged in purpose. He was the officer with empty hands. She was the lady with a ledger full of ghosts, and the pines bore witness to both. The frost arrived before the end of November, coating the village of Glencree in a fragile veil of white that sparkled under the weak light of morning. Each breath came out in pale clouds. Each footstep left a mark upon the frozen earth. Smoke curled steadily from chimneys, the scent of peat and pine heavy in the air, mingling with the ever-present hush of the surrounding forest. Inside the bakery, the stone hearth roared with flame, and Cecily moved in rhythm with the heat, kneading, shaping, sweeping, her sleeves rolled high, her hair tucked neatly beneath her linen coif, strands of chestnut clinging to her cheeks. Her hands, once soft and untested, were now lined with flour and calluses. No one questioned her place anymore. She was no longer the outsider who had arrived muddy and breathless. She was the woman who baked through the dark hours and left warm loaves on cold thresholds before dawn. But her presence in the village had deepened beyond ovens and work tables. Each afternoon, when the last batch had been shaped and left to rise, Cecily would take a satchel of supplies, cloth, dried herbs, whatever she could spare, and walk the long path into the woods, her boots crunching softly over frost-covered leaves. The bothy had become a second home, though no one called it that aloud. Within its low stone walls, the fire always burned. The children greeted her with wide eyes and quiet smiles, no longer hiding behind blankets. Bridget ran to her now, arms flung wide, her cheeks flushed with joy. and Cecily would lift her with ease, her heart aching each time at how light the girl remained despite her growing affection for the world again. Rafe was there too, always there, moving through the space with the calm and certainty of someone who had accepted solitude but had not surrendered to it. His presence was the hearthstone of that hidden sanctuary. He built, repaired, tended. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was low and sure, carrying the quiet authority of a man who had once commanded and had chosen deliberately to walk away from power. They had settled into a rhythm, no promises, no questions, only gestures, silences, and the work of keeping others alive. And yet between them, something unspoken grew, an understanding that did not yet dare name itself. It was on a bitter cold afternoon that Cecily returned from gathering herbs with Bridget when she found Rafe outside, his sleeves pushed up, chopping kindling in the snow. The sun was slipping behind the ridge, casting the sky in tones of pale fire. She paused at the edge of the clearing, her breath catching at the sight of him. The rough line of his jaw, the curve of his back as he swung the axe, the quiet precision of every movement. He saw her and stopped. "Come," he said. "The river's not frozen yet." He handed her a basket, the contents already prepared, a wrapped cloth, 2 cups, and a flask of broth. She said nothing, only nodded, and followed him. They walked side by side through the trees, their footsteps slow, deliberate. The air between them was heavy with things unsaid, and the pines murmured overhead, swaying gently with the wind. When they reached the riverbank, the world narrowed to the rush of water and the crackling hush of branches. Rafe unwrapped the cloth and placed it on a large, flat stone. Inside were 2 slices of bread, a small wedge of cheese, and a handful of dried berries. Cecily sat, the chill of the stone seeping through her skirts. She accepted the cup of broth he handed her, her fingers brushing his, warmth meeting warmth, and then withdrawing just before it lingered too long. "You come here often," she said softly. "When I need to remember I'm not made of stone," he answered. She looked at him, truly looked. In the golden light, his features seemed carved from something older than war or sorrow. His eyes, always guarded, now held a softness she had not seen before. "Why did you leave?" she asked. He didn't pretend not to understand. "Because orders don't absolve cruelty," he said. "I watched men obey. I watched women weep. I told myself I was different because I followed law, not pleasure. But I was wrong, and I could no longer carry the weight of being less cruel as if it were virtue." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the river's voice. "And you?" he asked after a moment. Cecily hesitated. Then slowly she set her cup down and unfastened the flap of her satchel. From it, she withdrew her mother's prayer book. She held it in her hands, her thumbs brushing the worn leather cover. "My name is Cecily Arden," she said, the words falling like stones into water. "Daughter of Sir Thomas Arden of Wicklow. Promised to Sir Alistair Fenwick in a contract signed without my knowledge. I fled the morning after I found evidence of his corruption, grain seized and resold at famine prices. I took the ledger. I carry it still." She looked up. Her heart pounded in her chest, and yet she did not waver. Rafe studied her, not with surprise, but with the kind of solemnity that feels like reverence. "I suspected," he said at last. "You didn't say. I was waiting to see what you would do with your freedom." She exhaled, her breath trembling in the cold. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I only knew I couldn't go back." He nodded. "Then you're not lost. You're choosing." They sat together as the light faded, neither speaking. The world around them fell quiet, as if listening for something fragile and real. Later, when they walked back toward the bothy, Cecily brushed a pine branch with her hand. The needles trembled. That night, back in her loft above the bakery, she opened her prayer book. Beneath the psalms, tucked between faded margins, were pages she had sewn in herself. Names, prices, shipments, the quiet accounting of a world built on hunger. She added a new entry. She wrote it with slow, deliberate strokes. R. Greystoke, former officer, protector of the lost. Speaks little, watches everything, a heart stitched with quiet rebellion, and beneath it, trusted. The next morning, she found Father Donnellan standing outside the chapel, wrapped in a worn brown cloak. The old priest's breath misted in the cold air, his hands clasped behind his back. "You've made yourself useful," he said without turning. "I hope so," Cecily replied. "But usefulness is not enough," he continued. "Not here." She waited. Glencree survives by silence, but it lives when it dares to speak. He turned to her, his face etched by wind and time. "You cannot remain in the middle, child. Not for long. Neutrality is an illusion. This place will call on your voice whether you're ready or not." Cecily met his gaze. "And if I speak, then speak with truth, and prepare to be heard." He walked away, his staff tapping against the frozen ground. Cecily watched him go, the morning sun rising slowly behind the pines. Her fingers, curled around her satchel, tightened slightly. In her heart, something had shifted. The lines between observer and actor, between guest and guardian, had begun to blur. A hearth without a name had become her sanctuary, but soon she would be called to defend it. The snow came with silence, falling in fine threads over Glencree like a benediction from a distant sky. By the fourth morning of December, the pines were dressed in white, and the rooftops of the village wore soft crowns of frost. A hush had settled across the valley, not peaceful, but expectant, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Cecily stood outside the bakery with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the flakes drift onto the stone path. Behind her, Myrene kneaded dough with sharp, practiced hands, the oven roaring. There had been no bread delivered to the bothy that morning. The children would wait, but she knew Rafe would worry. He was never careless, especially not when the skies promised change. When the first rider appeared on the ridge, Cecily's breath caught in her throat. A black stallion, armored tack, the red sash of command. A storm wrapped in velvet and steel. Behind him came 7 others, their horses blanketed in frost, the men cloaked in wool and leather, the standard of the crown slapping against the wind like a threat. Myrene stepped out beside her, drying her hands on her apron. "So," she murmured, not looking at Cecily, "the fox has found the hen house." Cecily said nothing, her heart beat loud in her ears, but her spine remained straight, her hands still. She watched as the riders descended into the village, drawing every gaze, silencing every step. Doors half closed. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Old men lowered their heads. Everyone in Glencree recognized the scent of danger, even when it arrived, dressed in gold buttons and polished boots. Sir Alistair Fenwick dismounted with a practiced elegance, his boots landing on the frozen ground like declarations. He was clad in a black damask doublet, silver embroidery glinting at the cuffs, a crimson sash slung across his broad chest. His face was ruddy from the cold, the sharpness of his beard impeccably groomed. He removed his gloves with the kind of precision that spoke not of grace, but of control. Cecily stepped forward. His eyes found her at once. "There you are," he said, his voice smooth and low. "Running has made your cheeks pink. It suits you." She did not flinch. "You shouldn't be here." "I come with legal authority," he replied, drawing a sealed parchment from the inner fold of his coat. "You are accused of theft, desertion, and the attempted defamation of a crown-appointed official." "You mean you?" she said. "I mean the law," he answered coldly. Then his voice shifted, the edge of a smile forming. "But you and I know the law is only the frame. Reputation is the canvas. And you, my dear, have painted quite a scene." Rafe's voice broke through the still air before she could speak. "She owes you nothing." He approached from the path between the chapel and the smithy, his sleeves dusted with snow, his coat open, eyes steady as the pines behind him. The crowd parted for him without a word. Fenwick's jaw tightened, but he did not turn. "Greystoke, I heard you went rogue. I should have known you'd find a nest of cowards to hide in." Rafe's posture didn't change. "I chose to protect those your policies abandoned." Fenwick turned at last, facing him. "You abandoned your commission, Your men, your queen." "No," Rafe said calmly. "I abandoned cruelty disguised as duty." The silence was thick as Fenwick studied him. Then in a single motion he raised his gloved hand. 2 soldiers stepped forward. "Disarm him." Cecily stepped between them, her hand raised. "No!" Fenwick arched a brow. "Still so bold. Has peasant bread turned you into a martyr?" "You speak of law," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the square. "Then hear the truth under the same name." She pulled the prayer book from her satchel and opened its cover. From inside she withdrew the folded pages, ink-stained, worn, but legible. She stepped past Rafe, past the soldiers, and handed the pages to the village priest, Father Donnellan, who had emerged from the chapel without a word. "These are records," she said. "Shipments, names, prices, times and places where food meant for starving families was seized, resold, and hoarded. With your seal, Sir Fenwick." The crowd stirred. Fenwick's smile did not falter. "And now you peddle fiction to old men and bakers," he said. "You forget your station." "I remember it," Cecily said. "And I reject it. I was born into silence. I will not die there." He stepped closer. "Come back with me to Dublin. Apologize publicly. Restore your honor. The crown forgives its daughters when they return." With bowed heads, her voice did not waver. "I will not bow." "Then you will be dragged," he said. "No," Rafe said, stepping between them again. "She stays." Fenwick's eyes narrowed. "You've no authority here." "And neither do you," said Father Donnellan suddenly, lifting the papers. "These accusations require review, and this village, though small, holds rights under the Queen's own decree. You will not take her until these claims are heard." Fenwick looked at the priest, then at the watching faces, the women, the children, the workers lined up in silent rows. He exhaled, then turned. "I will allow 48 hours for a hearing. If the girl is not delivered into my custody, the village will be considered complicit, and I will act accordingly." He mounted his horse, and with a flick of his hand the soldiers followed. Cecily stood frozen. Rafe stepped beside her, his voice low. "They'll return." She nodded. "There's not much time." She turned to him. "Then help me protect what's left." Their eyes met. And there, in the heart of the valley, dusted with snow, under a sky that threatened more than weather, a reckoning had begun, not in a court of nobles, but in the gaze of a woman who would not kneel, and a man who had already stood against power once before. The soldiers disappeared into the pines, but the cold they brought remained. Not the cold of weather, but of threat, of retribution, waiting in silence. And Cecily, her fingers still marked with flour, her hands still trembling from defiance, walked back toward the chapel, knowing that every step now was a step toward fire. Snow had begun to fall again by the time dusk reached Glen Cree, blanketing the valley in a silence that felt both sacred and fragile. The wind, though not harsh, carried a warning with each gust, an ancient whisper echoing through the trees, as if the land itself understood that what was to unfold that night would not be forgotten. Inside the chapel, candles flickered along the stone walls, their flames trembling like the hearts of those who had gathered there in hushed determination. The pews had been cleared to make space for baskets, blankets, and bundles of food. Myrene moved among them with the force of a tide, giving orders with her sleeves rolled up and her kerchief damp with sweat. Cecily stood at the center of the room, her hands steady, even as her breath came quick and shallow. She had spent the entire day in motion, gathering warm clothes from the villagers, mapping the forest paths with Father Donnellan, preparing the children for a journey none of them fully understood. They would leave that night. She looked at the faces around her, women tying shawls around their daughters' shoulders, boys clutching wooden toys and dolls made of straw, hands held tightly as if to tether each other against the unknown. They were all so small, and yet, in the lines of their brows and the quiet resolve of their eyes, there was a weight far beyond their years. Rafe had been taken at first light. Fenwick's soldiers had dragged him from the chapel steps in irons. his wrists bloodied from the struggle, his eyes never once leaving Cecily's as she was held back by two men with muskets and blank expressions. "You'll see them safe," he had said, just before they tore him away. "Promise me." Now she had only hours to fulfill that vow. The plan had been simple. While Fenwick prepared for his so-called tribunal 2 days hence, the villagers would smuggle the orphans out of Glen Cree under the cover of darkness. They would cross the pine woods by the narrow trails known only to hunters and shepherds and follow the frozen river eastward toward a safe hold kept by an old acquaintance of Father Donnellan's, a convent with stone walls and gates that still believed in mercy. But simplicity was not safety. The valley was being watched. Soldiers patrolled the main roads. Fenwick was no fool, and his pride had been wounded by Cecily's defiance. He would be eager to prove control, to punish the village with theatrical cruelty. The snow fell harder as night descended, blanketing the pines and muffling every sound. The mothers whispered prayers over their children's heads. Cecily moved from one to the next, tightening cloaks, tying belts, offering a word, a smile, a touch that lingered long enough to say what could not be said aloud. Myrene approached her, carrying a bundle of firewood as if it were a child. "The back door's ready," she said. "We'll take the lower ridge first, then down toward the ford. No torches, only moonlight." "Thank you," Cecily said. Her voice barely rose above the wind. Myrene touched her arm, briefly, fiercely. "You were not born one of us, but you've become our voice, our hands, our risk." Cecily met her gaze. They must live. That's all that matters. Outside, the forest waited. The first steps into the night were the hardest. Snow crunched beneath boots. Branches brushed their shoulders like solemn witnesses. Cecily led the way. Bridget held against her chest, the girl's thin arms wrapped tightly around her neck. Behind her, the line of children followed, small and quiet, guided by their caretakers, flanked by men with hunting knives and hearts carved by loss. No one spoke. Even the youngest knew instinctively that this was a march where silence could buy them life. For over an hour, they moved through the forest, winding between trees, stepping over frozen roots, the moon lighting their path in fractured silver. Cecily's fingers grew numb around Bridget's back, but she kept walking, breath after breath, prayer after prayer. The river came into view just before midnight, a ribbon of silver winding through the snow-laced trees. The ford was narrow, its stones slick but passable. On the other side, salvation lay just beyond the ridge. They were halfway across when the voice rang out. "Halt!" Torches flared. From behind a thicket of pines, a patrol emerged, 6 men in Fenwick's colors, muskets raised, boots trampling the snow like thunder. Panic rippled through the group. A child sobbed. One woman screamed. Myrene grabbed Cecily's arm, whispering, "Run! Take Bridget, I'll hold them off." But Cecily did not run. She stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, the child still in her arms. "I am Lady Cecily Arden," she said, her voice clear and ringing. "You know who I am." The soldiers hesitated. Among them, one stepped forward, a corporal young, his features tense beneath his cap. "You're under arrest," he said. "By order of Sir Fenwick." "I know," she replied. "But look around you. These are children, orphans. They have nothing, no weapons, no wealth, only their names and the road ahead." "They are fugitives," the corporal said. "No," she said. "They are survivors, and you have a choice." She shifted Bridget in her arms, exposing the child's face, sleeping, pale, her cheek pressed against Cecily's shoulder. "Will you report to Fenwick that you seized a 5-year-old, that you turned your musket on widows and their children?" The corporal's jaw tensed. The other soldiers shifted, uncertain. Cecily stepped closer. "I know what's in that ledger," she said. "The names, the villages, the seized grain Fenwick sold under false authority. Your mother's town was among them." "A Kilmora, wasn't it?" The corporal blinked. "You know what he did," she continued, "and now you have a chance to do what he never could. Mercy." Silence hung like frost between them. Then, slowly, the corporal lowered his weapon. "Let them pass," he said. The other men faltered, then followed his lead. Cecily exhaled. She looked back to Myrene and nodded. The march resumed, each footfall a quiet rebellion, each step a testament. They crossed the river. On the far bank, as the last of the children disappeared into the trees, Cecily turned once more. Rafe stood beside a horse, his wrists bound, 2 guards flanking him. His face was bruised, his coat torn, but his eyes were fixed on hers. She crossed back toward him, stopping only when she stood a breath away. "You saw them," she said. "I did. They are safe. For now." She looked at the guard beside him. "Let me speak to him. Just for a moment." The man hesitated, then nodded once. Rafe's voice was low. "You did what no officer ever dared." She reached up and gently touched the edge of his cheekbone where it had split. Her fingers lingered. "I will not let you hang for saving lives." Their eyes locked. Too many words, too much sorrow in the space of a single glance. "I'll come for you," she said. "You always were braver than me," he murmured. The soldiers pulled him away, and Cecily watched as he disappeared into the snow. The march was over. But the reckoning had only just begun. The wind that morning bore the sharp scent of firewood and frost, threading through the narrow lanes of Glencree with the quiet insistence of fate. Smoke rose slowly from stone chimneys, curling into the pale winter sky like prayers not yet answered. The village stirred with unease, men speaking in murmurs, women gathering their shawls more tightly around their shoulders, children watching wide-eyed from behind half-open doors. Something was shifting, rising, like the hush before a storm that would not pass unnoticed. And at the heart of it all stood the old chapel, its stones damp with snowmelt, its wooden doors opened wide, as if the building itself had drawn breath. Inside, benches had been pushed aside, candles lined the altar, and the scent of pine and wax mingled with the warmth of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Father Donnellan stood at the front, his expression solemn beneath his threadbare cowl. Beside him, Myrene O'Sullivan watched the door with arms folded, her jaw set in a line that would not bend. The village had come, not in protest, not in fear, but in defiance of silence. Cecily entered without ceremony, her cloak dusted with snow, her face pale but calm. She carried the prayer book in her hands, and though her fingers trembled slightly around its worn spine, her gaze did not falter. The moment she stepped into the room, all voices ceased, and then he entered. Sir Alistair Fenwick, clad in black once more, his silver embroidery dulled in the candlelight, his crimson sash like a wound across his chest. He strode down the centre of the chapel with calculated grace, flanked by 2 soldiers who did not meet the eyes of the villagers. He reached the front and turned to face the crowd, the ghost of a smirk at the corner of his lips. "This," he began, his voice cold and precise, "is absurd. An open hearing, conducted by peasants, presided over by a heretic priest, and driven by the ravings of a wayward girl." There was a murmur of protest, quickly silenced by Father Donnellan raising his hand. "This village is protected by charter," the priest said, his voice steady. "You may choose to mock us, Sir Fenwick, but the Queen's writ allows this gathering. We invoke it today, not in rebellion, but in pursuit of truth." Fenwick laughed once, low and humorless. "Truth? You speak of truth as if it can be summoned like rain. Very well. Let us indulge the fantasy. Let the lady speak." Cecily stepped forward. She opened the prayer book slowly, reverently, revealing the pages sewn within. Her ledger, her witness, the quiet testimony of months spent listening, watching, documenting what others feared to name. She looked out at the villagers, at the faces that had once met her with suspicion, then tolerance, then quiet hope. "My name is Cecily Arden," she said, her voice even clear. "I was born into a house of wealth and silence. I fled it to keep my soul. I do not come here as noble or rebel, but as a witness, and I ask you only this. Listen." She began to read. She spoke of grain shipments seized in County Wicklow, sold back to starving villages at triple the price, of names signed beside false decrees, soldiers acting on orders not from the crown, but from Fenwick's private hand, of towns that vanished from maps after the harvest failed and aid never came. She read dates, sums, names. She read of the dead, children who had not survived the winter, old men buried before spring thawed the earth, and the chapel fell into stillness. Fenwick's expression shifted from amusement to irritation, then to something darker. "You expect us to believe these scribbles?" he said sharply. "You forge pages and expect justice?" Cecily did not flinch. "The ink is not mine," she said. "It is yours." Father Donnellan held up one of the pages, displaying the seal still visible in the margin. "I have seen his mark before," he said, "on grain orders, on taxes paid in blood." There was movement at the rear of the chapel. A man stepped forward. The corporal, the same young soldier who had lowered his weapon by the riverbank. He stood tall, though tension lined his face. "I served under Sir Fenwick," he said. "I watched the wagons turn away from dying towns. I carried crates marked for crown distribution into the hands of private merchants, and I was ordered to silence those who spoke of it." Gasps echoed through the room. Then another man stepped forward, a miller known in Glencree, old and bent by years, but sharp-eyed. "I signed receipts I could not read," he said. "They said the grain was for taxes, but it never came back." The tide began to shift. Fenwick's jaw tightened. "Enough," he snapped. "This is a circus. You dare accuse me with the word of thieves and traitors. You—" He turned suddenly, striking out with the back of his hand. But Cecily did not fall. Rafe was there, dragged in by soldiers, wrists still bound, coat torn, face bruised. But he moved with purpose, with fury forged in silence. He stood between Cecily and the blow, catching Fenwick's wrist mid-air. The entire room froze. "You will not touch her," he said, his voice low and clear. "She is braver than any officer I ever knew, braver than I ever was." Fenwick yanked his arm away, snarling, "You dare raise a hand to me?" And then quietly, someone else spoke. "I dare." The voice came from the left, Fenwick's own lieutenant, a man in his 30s, known only as Lieutenant Harlan. He stepped forward now, his posture crisp, his eyes steady. "I lost my sister last winter," he said. "She died in a village that had no grain. I thought it was the Crown's failure. I see now it was yours." Fenwick looked at him in disbelief. "You side with them?" "I side with justice," Harlan replied, "and I will no longer carry your name." He turned to the soldiers still flanking Fenwick. "Place him under arrest." For a moment they hesitated. Then, slowly, they stepped forward. Fenwick's mouth opened in protest, but no words came. The villagers watched as his arms were bound, not with brutality, but with the quiet inevitability of a man undone by the very power he had used to wound others. Cecily stood still, her breath shallow, her hands curled around her prayer book. Rafe remained at her side, though his body swayed slightly from pain. Father Donnellan stepped forward, lifting his hand. "This hearing is ended. Let the record stand." And in that chapel a village found its voice, not with swords, not with fire, but with names, with pages, with the will of those who had refused to forget. As the doors opened and the winter light spilled in, Cecily looked up at Rafe. "You came back." "I never left," he said softly. And for the first time in many days, Glencree exhaled. The night before the execution was colder than any Glencree had known that winter. The snow had hardened into a crust beneath the villagers' boots, and the wind hissed through the pines like a whispered warning. No one slept, not truly. Fires burned low in hearths, not for warmth, but for presence, for the comfort of light when courage began to flicker. Cecily stood in the chapel alone. The pews were empty, the air thick with wax and silence. Before her the altar glowed with a handful of candles, their flames dancing faintly in the cold. She did not kneel to pray. Instead, she stood straight-backed, her hands gripping the edge of the altar rail, her breath slow and controlled. She had not wept, not when the verdict was read, not when Fenwick smirked in satisfaction, not when Rafe was dragged from the chapel in chains like a criminal. But now, in the quiet, her lips parted in a silent plea, not for a miracle, but for strength. Outside, dawn began to break, faint and grey, smearing the sky in shades of ash and bone. A bell rang once, low, deliberate, not the call of morning, not yet, but a summons. They were ready. The scaffold had been built at the edge of the square, where the road from the forest met the chapel path. Its wood was crude and fresh, its noose already swaying in the wind. Fenwick had wasted no time. His final order before being stripped of command was to execute Rafe for treason, claiming that disobedience in the face of the crown warranted death. Even as the lieutenant protested, even as villagers cried out in outrage, the order had remained sealed with Fenwick's name. Until the court in Dublin ruled, they were bound by its cruel legality. Cecily walked toward the scaffold with slow, deliberate steps, her cloak drawn tight against her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes unwavering. Behind her the villagers followed, not with torches or weapons, but with stillness and presence. An army of silence. Rafe was already on the platform, his hands bound, his coat hanging in tatters from his frame. The bruises on his face had deepened, his lip cracked, but his posture remained unbroken. He did not look at the crowd, he looked only at her. When she climbed the steps and stood beside him, a murmur rose. The soldiers shifted, uncertain. She turned to the corporal who held the rope in one hand. "I ask for a moment," she said, her voice ringing in the frigid air. He hesitated, glanced at Lieutenant Harlan, who gave a single nod. Cecily faced the crowd. "You've seen the truth," she said, each word precise. "You've heard it in this chapel. You've felt it in your bones." Her eyes swept over the villagers, the soldiers, the sky. "This man," she placed a hand on Rafe's arm, steadying him, steadying herself, "did not bring violence. He brought bread. He did not teach hate. He gave shelter to the forgotten. He did not abandon duty. He redefined it." The wind lifted her hair, pulling strands from her braid. Her voice rose, unshaken. "And now you must choose. Not between Fenwick's pride and this man's life, but between the kind of men you were told to be and the kind of men your own hearts know you are." The corporal stared at her, his hand still on the rope. His knuckles were white with tension. Cecily stepped closer. "You watched Fenwick lie. You watched him punish mercy and reward cruelty, and yet here you stand, rope in hand, ready to finish his work." She turned slightly, looking out again. "Well then, finish it. But know this. When the Queen asks how Glencree responded to injustice, your names will be written beside his." A hush fell so heavy it became unbearable, and then the corporal moved. He stepped forward, reached for the knot, and cut the rope. The blade hissed through the air like a breath released. The noose fell to the ground. Rafe swayed, blinking in disbelief, then turned to Cecily. Before either could speak, Lieutenant Harlan stepped forward. "Sir Alistair Fenwick," he called, turning to where the disgraced commander stood surrounded by uneasy soldiers. "You are hereby detained under suspicion of corruption, extortion, and abuse of military authority. You will be held under guard until a royal court may pass judgment." Fenwick's face drained of colour. "You dare?" he snarled. "You defy a knight of the Queen?" "I uphold the oath you abandoned," Harlan replied, "and I do not answer to a man whose power was built on starvation." With slow certainty, the soldiers stepped away from Fenwick and toward Harlan. Fenwick looked around, stunned, isolated. Then for the first time, he said nothing. The bells rang, not for death, not for fear, but for mercy. Cecily collapsed into Rafe's arms. Her breath hitched as his arms wrapped around her, not tight, not urgent, but steady. The embrace of two souls who had walked through fire and found the other still standing. The villagers wept openly, some with joy, others in sheer release. Myrene watched from the chapel steps, her arms crossed, her chin lifted. Father Donnellan stood beside her, his eyes misted, his fingers wrapped around his rosary. No one spoke, because nothing needed to be said. The bells kept ringing. And in that sound, pure, steady, endless, Glencree began to believe again, not in law, not in command, but in justice made flesh, in a woman who spoke the truth beside a scaffold, in a man who chose compassion over conquest, and in the sacred power of hands that untied the rope instead of tightening it. In the days after the rope fell and the bells rang, Glencree entered a silence unlike any it had known before. It was not the silence of dread, nor the hush of mourning. It was the quiet of soil pressed after sowing, of breath held before change. The scaffold remained untouched, its shadow stretching each morning over the frost-laced square, but no one dared dismantle it yet. Not out of fear, out of reverence, as if it had borne witness to something too sacred for haste. Fenwick, now a prisoner under guard in the chapel's crypt, awaited the Queen's judgment in chains, far lighter than the ones he had once fastened on others. His name no longer commanded obedience. The soldiers, though still clad in their livery, now followed the lieutenant's orders, and the corporal had taken to patrolling the village not with a drawn sword, but with eyes that watched for hunger and unrest. Rafe stood each morning beneath the pine that bowed toward the bothy, the very place where the children had last been hidden. His coat hung looser now, his face lean from weeks of strain, but his gaze was clear. He no longer looked over his shoulder. His breath did not catch with every footfall. The letter had come from Dublin on a chilled wind. The Crown granted him honourable discharge with no charges of treason. He was free, not as a soldier, but as a man. Still, Rafe had no uniform to return to, no command to reclaim. The blade of his former life had been sheathed for good, and strangely, he felt no loss. For the first time he could choose to stay, and so he did. The snow thickened. Days were brief, nights endless. Smoke curled from every chimney, scenting the air with peat and pine. The village, bruised but unbroken, turned its attention inward, to children, to cattle, to the thin stores of grain that would not last till thaw. It was Cecily who spoke first of the tithe. She stood in the chapel vestibule one morning, watching Myrene portion out flour with a flinty eye and an even hand. The sacks were dwindling. Whispers of hoarding had already begun. "Not all hunger begins in the belly," Cecily said softly, her gloved hands wrapped around her own arms. Myrene glanced up. "Speak plain, girl." "It begins in the mind," Cecily replied, meeting her gaze. "With fear. With the sense that you must protect what's yours, until what's yours is all that's left." Myrene pressed her lips together, then drew the curtain that separated them from the rest of the chapel. "And what would you have us do?" "Trust the mothers," Cecily said. "Let them keep the grain. Let them measure it and see who eats and who waits. A mother knows when a child lies about being full." The plan took root, not as policy, but as rumour. It spread in the warmth of hearths and the hush of baking ovens. Mothers came together, 4 at first, then 10. Cecily did not lead them. She only stood near the back, listening, nodding when spoken to, disappearing when not. The grain was moved to the chapel's cellar, placed in barrels marked not with names, but with chalk symbols known only to the women. Each household received according to need, not standing. And when questions rose, as they always did, it was Myrene who stepped forward in the chapel one cold Sunday and declared in front of the entire village, "This girl," she said, pointing to Cecily, "did not come to beg or command. She came to serve. She saw our hunger before we admitted it to ourselves, and she did not ask to be trusted. But I do. Trust her." The murmurs stilled. Some faces remained doubtful, but the tide had turned. Later that day, Myrene took Cecily by the wrist as she passed the altar. Her grip was firm. "You're one of us now," she said, "not because you earned it, because you gave it away." Cecily said nothing, but something within her eased. like a knot slowly coming undone. With the grain secured and the worst of the hunger blunted, Cecily turned to the children. The side room of the chapel, once used for candle storage, was swept clean, aired, and lined with benches carved by idle hands during winter watch. She taught by candlelight, kneeling beside muddy boots and curious eyes, tracing letters into soot-stained slates. She taught in both English and Irish, drawing gasps when the older boys realized she understood their tongue. She taught girls to read contracts and boys to write poetry. She taught without preaching, and the children, hungry for knowledge as much as bread, began to answer her in full sentences. One afternoon, Rafe stood in the doorway watching her. Her hands were black with charcoal dust, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove. A boy tugged at her sleeve with a broken quill, and she leaned over him, her braid falling forward, her voice low and patient. Rafe did not speak until the room had emptied, until the children had scattered like birds from a branch. She turned and found him still there. "You've built something," he said, stepping closer. "I only opened a door," she answered, brushing a smudge from her cheek. "They walked in on their own." He nodded, then reached into the pocket of his wool coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I've nothing fine," he said, his voice slower than usual. "No gold, no title, no promises that won't be broken by the next storm." She tilted her head. "But I made this." He unwrapped the cloth and revealed a ring carved from yew wood, polished and smooth, its edges marked with tiny runes she could not read, but felt in her bones. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took it. "I'm not asking you to marry me," he said quietly. "I'm asking if you'll stay, beside me, on your own terms, for as long as you want." The ring was warm from his hand. "I fled from a man who called himself mine before I had a say," she whispered. "And I ran to a place that didn't ask who I was." She looked up, her eyes meeting his. "You asked," she said. "And I say yes." They did not embrace. They did not kiss. They simply stood there in the last light of day, in a room still echoing with children's laughter, as the snow whispered against the window panes. Two people who had once been lost, and now, perhaps, found, together, in a place where seeds were buried in frozen soil, waiting for spring. The frost melted first on the chapel steps. No one noticed it at once, for the spring came slowly that year, unsure of its welcome. But on the third morning of March, just before the sun crested the ridge, Myrene O'Sullivan stepped outside with her morning pail and found the stone dry beneath her boots. No slickness, no sheen, just stone, bare and waiting. She looked up at the pale sky and whispered a single word: "Begin." In Glencree, beginnings were never marked by grand pronouncements. They arrived like shy children, peering from behind trees, uncertain if they'd be scolded or embraced. And so, as snow thinned to dew and pine cones dropped like coins from trees, life resumed its quiet beat. But for Cecily Arden, the morning that truly marked the end of one world and the beginning of another arrived with the post. The messenger was no soldier, no herald with banners or fanfare. He was a trembling lad on a borrowed pony, soaked through from crossing the river. Cecily found him standing awkwardly in the square, clutching a damp satchel, as if it might bite him. For Mistress Arden," he stammered. She took the letter with both hands, her breath already shallow before she saw the seal. It was from Dublin, royal ink, the mark of judgment or release. The villagers watched her open it. Some paused mid-task, others pretended not to notice, but the silence was telling. Even the wind stilled. She read it once, then again, slower, and finally she looked up. "It's over," she said softly. "Sir Alistair Fenwick has been stripped of title and lands. He will not return." Gasps rippled like wind through barley. A woman crossed herself. An old man whispered a prayer. The letter continued, of course. It was addressed not to Lady Cecily Arden of Whitbourne, nor to the accused, as Fenwick's documents once called her. No, it was addressed to Mistress Cecily Arden, No title, no possession, a woman unto herself. And more, within its folds a second paper invited her to court, not as supplicant nor criminal, but as adviser. A petition had been filed by the villagers of Glencree in her name, citing her mediation, her records, her school, her tithe. Someone in Dublin had read it, and offered her a seat at the table where decisions were made. That night, by the hearth in Myrene's cottage, Cecily read the letter aloud to Rafe. He said nothing for a long while. Then, "Will you go?" "I could," she answered. "I've earned the right." He nodded. "But I won't," she added, voice steady. He looked up. "This place," she said, her fingers brushing the worn wood of the table, "asks more of me than any court, and it gives more back." He reached into his coat. "I've something of yours," he said quietly, placing the object on the table. Her mother's prayer book. The cover had been cleaned, its leather stitched where it had split. A silk ribbon marked the page she had once tucked her notes behind. Her breath caught as she opened it. On the inside cover, in a hand she now knew as well as her own, was written, "You fled the altar once to save your soul. Now build a sanctuary with mine." Her fingers trembled as they traced the words. He didn't kneel. He didn't reach for her. He simply sat, waiting. She closed the book gently. "Yes," she said, her voice as soft as dusk. "I will." The chapel bells rang 3 times that Sunday, not for Mass, not for mourning, for union. There was no priest, no procession, just Myrene in her Sunday shawl, Father Donnellan beside her with the blessing of one who had seen too many marriages forged in property and fear. The village gathered, lining the pews, their faces open and lit with spring's new sun. Cecily wore no gown, only a simple green dress she had dyed herself. Around her finger was the wooden ring, the grain of the yew still warm from his touch. Rafe wore the coat she had mended, the collar still crooked where she'd stitched it by firelight. He carried no sword, only the open hands of a man who had chosen peace. They stood before the altar, beneath the cross, and made no vow that could be bound in law, but every word etched itself into memory. "I will not own you," he said, "and I will not fear you," she answered. "I will not rescue you, and I will not cage you. I will walk beside you, not before, and I will guard your name, not take it." There were no rings exchanged, only a palm to palm, a breath between them, and a silence so sacred even the bells dared not interrupt it. When they stepped outside, children ran before them, scattering petals, laughing. A girl with her hair in ribbons handed Cecily a small bouquet of wild thyme and pine needles. "For the school," she said proudly. Cecily knelt and hugged her. "For the world we're building." That evening, they walked through the forest. The same path where she had once stumbled, frightened and lost. The same clearing where she had met a man with empty hands and shadowed eyes. Now the trees whispered with new leaves, and birds called from branch to branch as if repeating a tale they'd heard in the wind. Rafe paused near the riverbank. "Do you hear it?" "The pines," she asked. "They remember." She looked up at the canopy above them, green now, alive, no longer buried in snow. And she imagined that yes, perhaps the trees did remember, a woman who arrived with nothing but a prayer book and a name she could not speak aloud, a man who had stopped killing just before he forgot how to live, a village that had once turned its back on strangers and had now woven those strangers into the fabric of its future. Cecily took Rafe's hand, and they walked until the stars appeared, quiet above them. They did not speak of the future. They were already in it. And somewhere far behind them, the wind shifted through the tall pines, like a breath held and finally released, a breath that whispered, "She came to disappear. She stayed to save a world." Glencree, Ireland, spring of 1604. The pines had grown taller. Children now climbed the lower trunks and swung from the branches as if they had never known fear. And perhaps they hadn't. Perhaps they had only ever known the world after the fire, after the gallows were lowered, after a woman stood beside a man in chains and called a village to choose mercy. 8 years had passed. The bothy where Rafe once sheltered orphans was now a place of stories and smoke. The village boys called it the Watchman's Hut, though none remembered who first gave it the name. A fire always burned there, even in summer. A carved walking stick stood propped at the door. Rafe's old officer's cane, now weathered, left like a signpost for wanderers. Inside, if one listened closely, laughter echoed like ghosts. And just beyond the clearing, in a long house with a red door and blue shutters, lived the woman the village once called a foreigner. They called her Cecily still, but now it was with reverence, not suspicion. To the children, she was Mistress Cecily, whose skirts smelled of rosemary and parchment, whose hands taught letters and truths, and whose eyes missed nothing. The school she built had outgrown the chapel. It stood now beside the stream, 2 stories high, with bookshelves carved by Rafe himself, and a bell that rang every morning just after sunup. The youngest child to ring it had once asked, "Did you build this all by yourself, miss?" "No," she had smiled, "but I dreamed it alone." Rafe Greystoke, once a nameless exile in his own country, had long since laid down his past. He walked now with a slight limp and eyes lined by sun and joy. He still carved wooden rings, though not for betrothals. These days his fingers were busy fashioning toys, spoons, and animal figurines for 2 spirited children who bore his slow smile and their mother's fire. Thomas, aged 7, had a jaw too proud for his tender heart. He often climbed trees just to make sure someone noticed he had done it. Eliza, 5, spoke in whispers to wild rabbits and drew pictures in ash with her bare fingers. Both had Cecily's auburn undertones in their hair and their father's grey eyes, eyes that always searched for what lay beneath the surface. They had no gold, no title, no land but what they touched with care. And yet, they were rich beyond measure. Each year, Cecily received another letter from Dublin, some offering roles in advisory councils, others inquiring if she might reconsider her refusal to serve as a royal commissioner for education. She answered each one the same. "The world I am building is here. You are welcome to learn from it, but I will not leave it behind." Not everyone had found peace. Sir Alistair Fenwick, disgraced and stripped of lands, vanished from record after being deported to Cornwall. It was whispered he lived alone, half-mad, haunted by the woman he once tried to possess and destroy. Some said he drank himself to death. Others claimed he found religion. Cecily never asked. Father Donnellan passed 3 winters ago, his last rites spoken in a chapel full of children's drawings, and women who once feared his sermons but came to trust his wisdom. Myrin O'Sullivan still presided over every village meeting like a war general, cane in hand and voice sharp as ever. But she no longer called Cecily the English girl. Now she called her daughter, and as for the Pines, they had never stopped whispering. Cecily often walked among them after dusk, alone, not out of sadness, but reverence. The trees had watched her arrive in fear. They had hidden her secrets. They had echoed the voices of frightened children and held the breath of lovers who dared not speak their feelings aloud. Now they bore witness to a world rebuilt. On the 8th anniversary of the day the gallows were raised and mercy prevailed, the villagers gathered on the chapel steps. Cecily and Rafe stood at the front, their children nestled between them. They unveiled a simple plaque carved in wood, nailed to the chapel wall. It read, "To those who chose justice when vengeance was easier, to those who chose peace when silence was safer, and to the woman who came to vanish, but stayed to plant 1,000 futures." When the bells rang, Cecily closed her eyes. She remembered her father's study, the cold draft down her neck, the ink on the marriage contract she never signed. She remembered the sound of pine needles under her boots the morning she fled. She remembered the boy beaten for knowing her name, the children crossing the river, the noose, the look in Rafe's eyes when he believed it might be the last moment. And then she opened her eyes. Thomas was tugging at her hand. Eliza pointed at the sky, where a bird circled in lazy arcs. Behind them, Glencree bustled with life. She turned to Rafe. He smiled that quiet smile that never needed words. And together, they walked home, through the forest that had once hidden them, past the stream that had once cleansed them, toward the house they had built not with stone or wealth, but with endurance, compassion, and every vow that had never been spoken aloud, only lived. And behind them, the pines whispered. They remembered everything. What did you feel when Cecily stepped onto that scaffold, when Rafe lowered his eyes in chains, trusting her to speak for them both? This was not just a love story. It was the story of a woman who chose courage over comfort, of a man who laid down his past to build a future with dignity, of a village that dared to listen when silence was safer. And perhaps it is a reminder to all of us that the quiet choices we make each day, the ones that cost us something, can bloom into legacies that outlive fear. If you made it all the way here, we know this story touched something in you. Write the word sanctuary in the comments below, so we know you stayed until the very last whisper of the pines. We'd love to hear what part of Cecily and Rafe's journey moved you most. Was it the chapel trial, the escape through the snow, or that final walk through the pinewood hand in hand? If this tale meant something to you, and if you feel moved to support the creative team behind these stories, you can now send us a super thanks here on YouTube, in any amount that feels right to you. Every gesture, no matter how small, helps us keep these timeless romances alive for everyone. And if you're not able to contribute that way right now, simply sharing this video with a friend who loves period dramas is another beautiful way to help us grow. One share could bring this story to someone who needed to hear it today. Before you go, we've left a few other unforgettable stories in the cards above, tales of love, resilience, and women who changed their destinies with quiet strength. From our hearts to yours, thank you, and may the pines always whisper your name.